Hi everyone, here we are at Monash MADA, which is Monash Art, Design and Architecture, and we're here with Tom, who is a studio leader. Tom has a project with his students that is called Mars 2.0, and it's all about building a city on Mars. So Tom, how did this project started?
It really had its genesis in, I guess, Elon Musk's SpaceX company, and the kind of imagery that came out of the early press releases around that, and also the images from, I think it was Mars One, which was the sort of the startup, the reality TV show on Mars. And there was something about the way that the societies and the cities that were being projected were being discussed that kind of lacked the kind of rigor and the volatility and the vitality of real cities. And in many ways, this is kind of, building off a long heritage of sort of imagings of suburbia in space, dating back to O'Neill and dating back to sort of the Island One kind of habitats. And so the studio was originally an attempt to challenge the kind of anodyne image of a city on Mars, but it was also a really good way to get students to forget a lot of the baggage that they had about the way that cities function on Earth. Mars then acted as a totally new slate to imagine new kinds of cities and new kinds of urban spaces.
So what is the brief that students get for this project?
Again, building off, I think, SpaceX's model that was for a community of between 80 and 200,000. It was notionally self-sustaining. In past studios, there'd been a focus on the kind of relationship between different communities, and certain students had kind of built off other people's processes and, I guess, latent terraforming that was happening in their speculative scenarios. But in the current guise, it is far less about a concrete population and more about a model for living. So students' work will range from things that are effectively like little villages in space up to large agglomerations of, tens of thousands of people.
So some of the things the students have to take in account as architects is that architecture is there also to allow for human interaction. And different students tackle that in different ways. Someone in a very abstract way, sort of seeing almost building a city from scratch as a play, as a way to play with elements. And some went in a very practical way, thinking even that some of the architecture will evolve around the food that they have to grow. So can you sort of guide us through some of the examples of the projects?
So from the layer of the very abstract, so there were cities that were primarily based around play. Bryony Ewing's city was sort of a riff on this idea of play as the ultimate creative practice, and the city kind of built itself. Andrew Kopolov's city here as well, on the surface it sort of seems pragmatic, but it's built around this idea of very, very small incremental changes in a generic framework. I think he was sort of seeing it as having a kind of an architecture like an Antarctic base that would gradually get filled out with lots of small modifications as the civilization became a sort of a real and going concern on Mars. Daniela Krasnadi's model was one that was built entirely around sort of complex relationships between food and the resident population, and she was sort of trying to create productive spaces that were also spaces that might serve the resident of this new city. So areas that were sort of provided for growing rice were also bathing areas. Dining rooms became sort of spaces that were festooned with productive vines. It was quite a beautiful image of the complex ecologies that might exist in a world that was quite internalized by necessity. And other students were sort of working less with the idea of the city as much as it was with an idea of landscape. So Gideon Bramwell's, I guess, models of the terrain as a new instigator for thinking about, I guess, the way that an urban space might colonize the existing completely out of scale and unusual landscape features of Mars, was an interesting step away from just laying a terrestrial Earth city onto a new planet. Others were completely about sort of, the metaphor of a sort of city, an alien city. So Pearl Dempsey's one was primarily about the idea of a city as a set of interrelationships, and her models are sort of meant to be images of the kind of the complex interrelationships and also feuds that might exist in any new kind of off-world colony.
So Mars, often people just see it as kind of fun hobby things to do and go and visit and take samples, and often don't see real value in having Mars as a study case. But we know we have to think of this. It's giving us basically a quite unique environment to do a lot of things that otherwise we wouldn't have a chance to do.
I think with Mars, I mean, and the reason why it's sort of such a strange one, especially for architecture, is that the conditions on Mars sort of wrap up a lot of the conditions that are facing us now. We are obviously incredibly sort of aware of the way that the climate and these sort of external factors are now dominant issues. The biosphere is not something that is always benign. Mars is a completely new biosphere. It requires the manufacturing of that at some point. The issues that are facing sort of terraforming on Mars are similar issues that we'll face here in a sort of a runaway climate scenario, or actually any scenario over the next 100 years. At the same time, it sort of acts as a good model for the frontier, and I think in terms of utopian production or sort of urban production of ideal states, that always is tied to the frontier. And you can look at the US in sort of the 19th century for those models, and you can look to, I guess, other frontiers that we might have encountered in the 20th century, sort of industrial frontiers or social frontiers. So Mars kind of wraps up a lot of the stuff that allows people to think about the city that we've sort of had in the back of our mind since sort of the Renaissance, really. But it does sort of make immediate a lot of the issues that we are currently facing.
Well, thank you very much, and we will hear from some students as well about their projects. Here we are with Gideon, who is a third-year architecture student, and he's going to tell us about his project. So how did you get the idea of using high-rise images from Mars for your project?
I guess it sort of came from like the desire to want to sort of explore the more like realistic elements of Mars. Like obviously being an architecture studio, it gets quite conceptual, but I wanted to bring back some reality to it. So high-rise was a really good spot to start in. Realize how big their like catalog of images is, and it's massive. So I just like chose some that kind of represented certain phenomena which I didn't realize existed, and then basically use that to kind of drive the whole project. Okay,
I see 3 regions of Mars that you picked. What was sort of idea to, or what is the criteria that you used to pick the 3 different regions?
It's actually just pretty simple. Tom gave us, our studio lecturer, gave us different segments of Mars, which was good. It limited us to certain areas, which meant I couldn't do really like romantic sites like, the Valles Marineris. I had to choose quite boring sites, to be honest, but I had to work within that. So that was good. I found some interesting stuff that I didn't realize about Mars.
So some of these features incorporate a possibility of mining water?
Yeah. So yeah, this first one here on the right is, they call it on high-rise the volatile gullies. So basically there's this segment of Mars with all these gullies that have brine water that seep out from the crevices. So I thought that was really interesting, and I decided to use that to kind of push that first one into building like canal cities. And then yeah, kind of followed that thread through, and then this is like a polar region, and there's a lot of sediment and thermokarst in the area. So I kind of like twisted the science a bit to kind of like romanticize the whole idea and then create a sediment mound. And then the third one, you've got these mineral veins. So basically, from what I read, it was kind of like highly rich in mineral water kind of eroded the site, and then the site was left as this bedrock. And I kind of tried to like push that erosion metaphor further. So they're all sort of metaphorical in a sense.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Here we are with Frank, who is also a third-year architecture student, and he had quite a unique project, quite different than the rest of the projects shown this year. Mm-hmm. What was the inspiration for that?
I guess that's a hard question. I guess it came out of a response to something about ideal cities and the possibility of an ideal city, and trying to steer away from centering the city around a single set of values, which usually excludes groups of people that don't hold those values. Mm.
So you basically created a pathway where some rules of the city are set, and then the audience chooses the way they build a city.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And here is the example of all of the possible scenarios. So they printed in tiny letters, and you have to use magnifying glass if you want to read. But it just shows the amount of work that went into this sort of considering different scenarios that people might choose. So what is your favorite scenario?
I don't really know if I have a favorite scenario, actually. I actually don't think I've cycled through them all. I mean, there's 300,000 here, and then based on the choices of the user, when they set up their scenario, it prints them out a unique planning code document for their ideal city on Mars. So then you have, with the 300,000 possible combinations of the cities from the user's choice, you have millions of combinations for the possible planning code.
So you had several steps that a user has to go through. What were they revolving around?
You can see this is a very heavily text-based project, which is not conventional in architecture. And it kind of starts from a reading of the city as a text that can be read itself in a number of different ways. And so those choices are different ways that you can read the city like a text. So for example, you can read it with a formal approach, as you would a book. You would take a formal approach to literary criticism, or a biographical approach to literary criticism, but apply those approaches to the city. And what you end up with is these kind of heavily ideologically infused descriptions of a city, but they're also kind of ambiguous about their ideological affiliations. And so then as the user constructs their city from these passages, I can read into the choices that they're making, read into the choices about what their kind of ideal city might be.
Yes, I mean, this is what I liked about the project, that I was sort of forced to choose between different ways it was going, but then that would restrict me, what can I choose next?
Yeah, exactly.
So it was, and it always kind of recognizing what is it that works for me. So it's a very reflective for users as well, which is very exciting.
And also not kind of dry and analytical, it's their kind of like very emotive descriptions of the city, creative. Yeah.
Yes, and I think for somebody outside architecture, it reminds you that cities are more about social interaction, not so much about buildings as a sort of empty spaces.
And ideas and values and beliefs.
Yes, and how architecture can influence those ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.